7-year-old Kenji Sato crouched behind the charred remains of what had once been the village school, his stomach cramping with a hunger so familiar it had become part of him. The spring morning of April 3, 1945, carried something impossible on the wind through the ruins of Shimonoseki, a scent that made his mouth water and his mind reel in confusion. It was sweet, warm, and utterly foreign, drifting across the devastated landscape like a memory from another world entirely. Beside him, his younger sister Yuki clutched their baby brother Taro closer to her thin chest, her 6-year-old eyes wide with the same bewilderment that gripped Kenji. For months, their world had consisted of bitter radish soup, the occasional handful of rice mixed with sawdust, and the constant gnawing ache of never having enough. Yet this aroma spoke of abundance so complete, so impossible, that it challenged everything they had been taught about their enemy and their war. We jump back in. Tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Sato children had never known peace. Born into a Japan consumed by military fervor and imperial destiny, their earliest memories were of ration lines, air raid sirens, and the gradual disappearance of everything that had once made childhood sweet. Their father had marched away to fight the Americans in the Philippines when Kenji was 4, leaving behind only a photograph in military uniform and promises of glorious victory. Their mother had died during the terrible winter of 1944, succumbing to tuberculosis in a city where medicine had become as scarce as mercy. Now they lived with their elderly grandmother, Obasan, in the basement of their bombed-out home, surviving on whatever scraps the old woman could gather from the ruins of their neighborhood. The children had been raised on stories of American demons, pale-faced monsters who tortured prisoners and ate babies, subhuman creatures whose only purpose was the destruction of Japan's divine mission. Their school teachers, before the schools were destroyed, had shown them cartoons of grotesque American soldiers with fangs and claws, being so evil that death was preferable to capture. Yet this scent floating through the morning air whispered of something entirely different. It spoke not of demon food, but of something magical, something that belonged in the fairy tales their grandmother had told them before the war made such frivolities seem shameful. The aroma was growing stronger, and with it came other impossible smells. Rich coffee, something that reminded Kenji of the bacon his grandfather had cooked years ago during New Year celebrations, and underneath it all, that strange, sweet fragrance that seemed to pull at his very soul. Following the scent meant leaving their hiding place, venturing beyond the safe boundaries their grandmother had established for their daily scavenging. It meant risking everything for what was probably a delusion brought on by hunger and hope. But Kenji found himself moving anyway, drawn by something stronger than fear or caution. Yuki followed without question, as she always did, trusting her older brother to navigate the dangerous world that adults had left them to inhabit alone. They picked their way through the rubble-strewn streets of what had once been a thriving port district, passing the skeletal remains of buildings that Allied bombing had reduced to concrete bones and twisted metal. The harbor beyond was eerily quiet, its waters reflecting the gray morning sky like a mirror of despair. Most of the fishing boats had been requisitioned for military use months ago, and those that remained lay broken and listing in the shallow water. As they climbed over a pile of debris that had once been someone's home, the source of the impossible aromas finally revealed itself. In a small clearing where several destroyed buildings had left an unexpected pocket of open space, 3 figures in unfamiliar uniforms sat around what appeared to be a small cooking fire. The men were tall, far taller than any Japanese adult the children had ever seen, with skin that was indeed pale, but in a way that spoke of health rather than the sickly pallor of malnutrition that had become common in their city. One of the figures was tending to a metal contraption that seemed to be producing the magnificent smells, while another was pouring dark liquid from a metal pot into small cups. The third was engaged in some kind of maintenance work on what looked like radio equipment, occasionally speaking in low voices using words the children didn't understand. Their uniforms were clean, well-fitted, and bore insignia that Kenji recognized from propaganda posters as American military markings. These were the enemy. These were the demons their teachers had warned them about, the monsters who had bombed their city and killed their neighbors. Yet nothing about what they observed matched the terrifying descriptions they had heard throughout their short lives. The Americans moved with casual efficiency, their conversation punctuated by what sounded remarkably like laughter. There was something profoundly normal about the scene, something that contradicted every story, every warning, every piece of indoctrination the children had absorbed. The man working the cooking device looked up from his task and said something to his companions that made them all smile. In that moment, Kenji caught a glimpse of white teeth, clear eyes, and an expression of contentment that he had not seen on an adult face in longer than he could remember. These were not the faces of demons or monsters. They were simply men, sharing a meal in the morning sunshine, seemingly at peace with their world and each other. The cooking device itself was unlike anything the children had ever seen. It appeared to be some kind of portable kitchen, compact but obviously capable of producing the variety of smells that had drawn them here. Steam rose from multiple compartments, and the American tending it moved with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to abundance rather than scarcity. He reached into a bag beside him and withdrew what looked like small, round objects that he began placing into the device with careful attention. As the minutes passed, the impossible aromas grew stronger and more complex. The sweet smell that had first captured their attention was now accompanied by others that made the children's empty stomachs clench with desperate longing. There was something that reminded Kenji of the sugar cakes his grandmother had made before rationing eliminated such luxuries from their lives. Another scent spoke of eggs, real eggs, not the watery substitutes made from questionable powders that had become their occasional protein source. The Americans seemed to have an endless supply of materials for their meal. Packages and containers surrounded their makeshift camp, more food visible in one place than the children had seen since before their mother's death. One of the men opened a can using a small tool, revealing what appeared to be fruit preserved in syrup. Another unwrapped something that looked like chocolate, breaking off pieces and sharing them among his companions with the casual generosity of people who had never known scarcity. Yuki tugged at Kenji's sleeve, her small face showing the same mixture of fascination and confusion that he felt. Baby Taro had fallen asleep against her shoulder, lulled by the warmth of the morning sun and the rhythmic sounds of the American voices. For a moment, watching these enemy soldiers share their abundance in the ruins of their city, the children felt something they had almost forgotten existed, a sense of normalcy, of life continuing despite destruction, of people finding moments of simple pleasure amid chaos. The man at the cooking device called out to his companions, and they began gathering around him with obvious anticipation. Kenji watched as plates were produced from somewhere in their equipment, real plates that looked clean and unbroken, not the chipped bowls and makeshift containers that had become standard in Japanese households. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means food was distributed with the easy efficiency of people accustomed to having enough for everyone, with no careful measuring or worried calculations about making supplies last. Each American received a plate loaded with portions that would have fed Kenji's family for days. There were the round objects that had been producing the sweetest aroma, golden brown and steaming, unlike anything in the children's experience. Alongside them were strips of meat that sizzled with fat, eggs that looked impossibly yellow and rich, and other items that defied identification but spoke eloquently of abundance beyond imagination. One of the Americans said something that made the others laugh, and they began eating with obvious enjoyment. The sounds of their satisfaction carried clearly across the clearing. Appreciative murmurs, casual conversation, the clink of metal utensils against plates. It was a symphony of normalcy that highlighted just how abnormal the children's world had become, a reminder of what mealtimes had once been like before war made every bite precious and every meal uncertain. As they ate, the Americans maintained their easy camaraderie, sharing food from each other's plates and passing around the dark liquid they had been preparing. The scene was so far removed from the children's understanding of enemy behavior that they found themselves questioning not just what they were seeing, but everything they had been taught about the nature of their enemies and their war. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. These were supposed to be monsters, creatures of pure evil bent on Japan's destruction. Yet here they sat, sharing breakfast in the sunshine, displaying the kind of casual abundance and genuine fellowship that had disappeared from Japanese society months ago. Their behavior spoke not of supernatural malevolence, but of simple human contentment, of people who had enough and were generous with what they possessed. The man who had been working on the radio equipment stood up and walked to a different pile of supplies, returning with what appeared to be packages of additional food. He distributed these among his companions with the offhand generosity of someone drawing from an inexhaustible supply. The packages themselves were marvels to the children's eyes, brightly colored, intact, bearing pictures and writing that suggested a world where food came wrapped in clean materials and marked with appealing images. As the Americans continued their meal, details emerged that challenged every aspect of the children's indoctrination. Their uniforms, while clearly military, were clean and well-maintained, rather than the tattered, blood-stained garments that Japanese propaganda had suggested would clothe an army stretched to its breaking point. Their equipment was not only functional, but appeared to be of high quality, suggesting an industrial capacity that could afford to provide its soldiers with the best available materials. The radio itself was a compact marvel of engineering, clearly more advanced than anything the children had seen in Japanese hands. Its operator adjusted dials and spoke into a handset with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to reliable communication across vast distances. This was not the desperate improvisation that had characterized Japanese military operations in recent months, but the systematic application of superior technology to the challenges of warfare. The children remained hidden in their observation post, torn between fascination and fear, unable to reconcile what they were witnessing with everything they had been taught to believe. The aroma of the strange round objects continued to drift across the clearing, making their mouths water and their stomachs clench with longing. Whatever those golden circles were, they represented a kind of food that existed beyond the children's experience, something that belonged to a world of plenty rather than the world of scarcity they inhabited. The realization was beginning to form in Kenji's 7-year-old mind that perhaps, just perhaps, everything they had been told about their enemies might be as empty as their rice bowls. These Americans did not look like a people being defeated. They did not act like soldiers fighting desperately for survival. Instead, they displayed the easy confidence of people who knew they had already won, who could afford to take time for proper meals and casual conversation because their victory was simply a matter of time and logistics. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the ruins around them and highlighting the stark contrast between destruction and abundance, between the children's desperate scavenging existence and the Americans' casual plenty. In that growing light, the foundations of everything Kenji and Yuki believed about their world began to shift, preparing them for revelations that would transform not just their understanding of the war, but their entire conception of what was possible in a world they were only beginning to comprehend. The tallest of the 3 Americans suddenly stood up, stretching his arms above his head in a gesture so casual and unguarded that it sent a shock through Kenji's understanding. Enemy soldiers were supposed to be constantly vigilant, always ready for attack, perpetually scanning for threats. Yet this man moved with the relaxed confidence of someone who felt completely secure in his environment, as if the very concept of danger had been eliminated from his world. He walked over to another collection of supplies that the children hadn't noticed before, partially hidden behind a fallen concrete beam. When he returned, his arms were loaded with packages that made Kenji's breath catch in his throat. There were enough wrapped items to feed their entire neighborhood for days, yet these 3 men were treating them as casual provisions for a single meal. The American began distributing the packages among his companions with the same thoughtless abundance they had shown with everything else.
One package was torn open to reveal small cakes wrapped in individual papers, each one perfectly formed and identical to the others. In Japan, such uniformity could only be achieved by master craftsmen working with precious ingredients, yet here were dozens of these perfect confections being shared as if they were ordinary items. Another package contained what appeared to be candy, bright-colored pieces that caught the morning light like jewels. The Americans popped these into their mouths while continuing their conversation, treating sugar as if it were as common as water. The man who had been operating the cooking device called out something that sounded like a question, and one of his companions responded by tossing him a small metal container. The cook caught it effortlessly and opened it with a tool attached to the side, revealing a thick, dark substance that he began spreading on the golden round objects. The rich aroma that emerged made Kenji dizzy with longing, a smell so decadent and impossible that it seemed to come from dreams rather than reality. What the children were witnessing went beyond mere abundance. This was systematic plenty, the casual deployment of resources that suggested an entire civilization built on the assumption that there would always be enough. Every movement, every gesture, every decision the Americans made reflected a mindset that had never known true scarcity. They didn't carefully portion their food or save wrapper papers for reuse or calculate how long supplies might last. Instead, they consumed with the confident expectation that more would always be available. The radio operator adjusted his equipment and began speaking into the handset in English, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. Though the children couldn't understand the words, the tone was relaxed, almost conversational. He was clearly reporting to someone, but there was none of the urgent desperation that characterized Japanese military communications these days. Instead, his report sounded routine, as if checking in with superiors was simply a scheduled activity rather than a desperate plea for reinforcement or supplies. During his conversation, the other two Americans continued eating, occasionally offering each other bites of different items and maintaining their easy fellowship. One produced a metal container that he opened to reveal what looked like preserved fruit, bright yellow pieces floating in clear syrup. He shared these around with generous spoonfuls, treating what would have been an unimaginable luxury in Japan as casual dessert. The children watched in amazement as sticky syrup dripped from the spoons, precious sweetness being lost to the ground without a thought. When the radio operator finished his transmission, he rejoined his companions and was immediately handed a plate loaded with the same abundance the others were enjoying. No one had saved his portion or worried about it growing cold. There had simply been enough for everyone, with the comfortable assumption that his needs would be met when he was ready. This casual certainty about provision spoke to a level of organizational efficiency that made Japanese military logistics look primitive by comparison. As they continued eating, the Americans began sharing items from personal bags, revealing an even more stunning array of abundance. One pulled out what appeared to be chocolate bars, real chocolate, darker and richer looking than anything Kenji had seen even before the war. Another produced packages of what looked like dried fruit, items that had become legendary luxuries in Japan's rationing system. A third opened a container of nuts, pouring them freely into his palm and offering handfuls to his companions. The children began to understand that what they were witnessing wasn't a special meal or celebration ration. This was simply how these men ate every day. The casual nature of their abundance, the way they shared without counting or measuring, the assumption that tomorrow would bring equally plentiful provisions, all pointed to a supply system so vast and reliable that individual soldiers could afford to be generous with items that Japanese civilians would have treasured. The cook began preparing something new on his device, and soon the air filled with yet another impossible aroma. This one reminded Kenji of the fish his grandfather had grilled during festival days, but richer and more complex. The American was cooking what appeared to be meat, actual meat in quantities that would have represented a month's protein ration for a Japanese family. Fat sizzled and popped in the pan, sending up aromatic smoke that spoke of abundance so complete it seemed almost violent in its excess. While one man cooked, another opened a different type of container that revealed fresh vegetables. Actual fresh vegetables, green and crisp and unblemished by the kind of careful preservation and creative substitution that had become necessary in Japanese cooking. He began slicing these with a sharp knife, creating neat portions that would be consumed in a single meal, rather than carefully rationed across days or weeks. The casual destruction of such valuable nutrition seemed almost criminal to children who had learned to make a single radish last for multiple meals. The third American was engaged in some kind of maintenance activity on their equipment, but even this revealed telling details about their situation. His tools were specialized, high quality, and numerous. There were spare parts visible in organized containers, suggesting a supply chain that could afford redundancy and replacement rather than the endless improvisation and repair that characterized Japanese equipment management. Everything these men possessed spoke of an industrial base that could afford to send its soldiers into the field with backup plans for their backup plans. As morning progressed into late morning, more details emerged that shattered the children's understanding of military reality. One American casually discarded packaging materials that would have been treasured in Japan, throwing away metal containers and paper wrappings that Japanese families would have carefully cleaned and saved for reuse. The waste seemed almost sinful, but it clearly reflected an economy where replacement was easier than conservation, where new items were more readily available than repaired ones. The radio crackled to life again, and the operator responded to what seemed to be a routine check-in. His casual tone suggested that communications were reliable and regular, that he could count on making contact whenever necessary, rather than hoping for occasional successful transmissions. This reliability extended to everything about their operation. Their equipment worked smoothly, their supplies were comprehensive, and their coordination appeared effortless. When one American finished eating, he didn't carefully clean his plate for reuse or worry about conserving washing water. Instead, he simply wiped it clean with a disposable cloth and packed it away, clearly expecting that cleaning supplies would be readily available when needed. Another opened a container of what appeared to be soap and began washing his hands in water poured generously from a metal bottle. The casual use of clean water for personal hygiene, rather than conserving every drop for drinking and cooking, revealed assumptions about abundance that the children found almost incomprehensible. The conversation among the three men continued throughout their meal, punctuated by laughter and easy camaraderie. Their demeanor suggested people who felt confident about their mission, secure in their position, and certain of eventual success. There was none of the grim determination or desperate courage that had characterized Japanese military propaganda. Instead, these men displayed the relaxed professionalism of people who knew they had overwhelming advantages and could afford time for proper rest and nutrition. One American began repacking equipment with careful but unhurried efficiency, organizing supplies in a way that suggested they expected to be here for some time, or at least had no immediate pressure to relocate. Their movements were deliberate rather than urgent, reflecting a tactical situation where they could afford patience and proper procedure rather than desperate improvisation. Everything about their behavior suggested an army that was winning comfortably rather than fighting for survival. As the meal concluded, the children watched the Americans dispose of waste and organize their remaining supplies. Even their trash revealed abundance beyond Japanese comprehension. Empty containers that would have been precious storage items were discarded without thought. Food scraps that could have made soup for a Japanese family were casually thrown away. Packaging materials that represented valuable resources in Japan's recycling economy were treated as disposable refuse. The implications of this waste were more devastating than any propaganda could have been. This wasn't an army stretched to its limits, carefully husbanding resources and making do with inadequate supplies. This was a military force so well provisioned that its soldiers could afford to throw away items that their enemies would treasure. The psychological impact of this realization began to work its way into the children's understanding, challenging not just their beliefs about American capabilities, but their entire conception of the war's likely outcome. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.